So today I'm solving a storage problem on my workstation. Now, as a matter of principle, I don't like keeping stuff on my workstation, on my desktop. I would rather keep it in a place where it's safe, it's backed up, it's protected with RAID and ZFS integrity. So all of my video projects, all of that kind of stuff is all safely on my NAS. But I've got one type of data that's still filling my hard drive completely, and that's games. So I've got like 600 gigs of games on this thing. I only have a 1 terabyte SSD. So I'm going to see what it's like to move my games library onto the network. Now I know plenty of people have done this before, and there's other videos showing how to do it. But I really want to understand what is the performance impact of moving my games onto the network. What do I need on the network side, hard drives, SSDs, RAM, etc. What network bandwidth do I need? And how much sharing can I do between multiple computers on the network that have similar games in their library? So if those are questions that you've always wanted to answer, then come along on this adventure. Now for this test, I'm using SSDs provided by ORICO. These are PCIe Gen 4 and they're very fast. For the NAS, I've got a unit that supports PCIe Gen 4x4 on 2 slots, and I'm putting the SSDs in those 2 slots. Now the drives also come with heat sinks, which is great, but I'm not going to use them because the NAS has a built-in thermal solution. So I just got to get those guys in the first 2 slots there. They'll be able to perform well. I tested it with Crystal Disk Mark, and the disk got over 7,000 megabytes per second read, which is what's advertised. I've got 2 of them here, so I can try different combinations of RAID, mirrors versus stripes, or just single disks, depending on the test. I'm starting out with a simple proof of concept over gigabit. So if it works over gigabit, it'll probably perform better over 10 gig. But I'm hoping to see a performance decrease on gigabit, so at least I know that I'm testing the right things. Now I've seen 2 different protocols that people have used for this. I could use Windows file sharing or server message block, the SMB protocol. I could also use a block device protocol, iSCSI. Those 2 are both built into Windows. I don't have to install any extra junk. Those 2 I'm going to try. I also kind of want to try NVMe over TCP, but that's not well supported on Windows, so I guess we'll see how that goes. So since I have 2 drives, I'm starting by setting one up for iSCSI and one up for Samba. So for the iSCSI drive, I installed Target CLI, used Target CLI, followed some instructions on the ArchWiki. The ArchWiki is like always the place to go for weird Linux stuff. They have all the weird Linux stuff. I'm actually using Debian, but ArchWiki, Target CLI commands still work fine. iSCSI is a bit of a weird protocol. They use these identifiers called IQNs. They have basically no security, but you have to copy these long hashes and UUIDs back and forth between the systems so that they work. I don't know who thought this was a good idea, but it's terrible. But on Windows, I can set up the iSCSI initiator, find my portal, identify the drive I've exported. It'll show up in disk management in Windows. From there, I can create a Windows partition table and an NTFS file system. And from this point on, an iSCSI drive will really show up just like a real drive on the system. So tools like Crystal Disk Mark, they'll be able to find it and treat it as a real drive. For SMB, it was also not that hard. I formatted the drive with ZFS. You guys know I love ZFS, even if it's only single disk. I created Samba config. I kind of raw dogged both the ZFS and Samba command line without any sort of UI. But if you have your favorite NAS, it'll do all that for you. You don't have to type out the zpool commands and the Samba commands. Then I mounted it as a lettered drive, G on Windows. So Steam sometimes requires lettered drives or different things. I don't know why. Some programs don't work with network paths. They have to have drive letters. Windows files are weird. So I did try to set up NVMe over TCP on Linux, and the server side went just fine. However, there's no native initiator side for NVMe over TCP in Windows. So NVMe over TCP is very similar to iSCSI in design. It uses very similar naming conventions. They call them NQNs instead of IQNs, except instead of using the SCSI command set over TCP, it uses the NVMe command set over TCP. And in theory, if everything you're doing is NVMe based, it can be more efficient. You don't have to translate the commands from SCSI to NVMe and back. I tried the StarWinds initiator. It's not open source. It's not free, but it has a trial. And I tried that, and it didn't work for me. So it only supported IPv4. And it didn't support DNS either, so I had to actually give an IPv4 address to my test server here. I actually had to type out the address instead of using domain names, and it still locked up a lot. So I was unable to get an NVMe disk to mount on Windows. So I gave up on NVMe over TCP and just stuck with iSCSI and Samba. So I looked through my games library and tried to find a very modern game with a built-in benchmark. I don't want to try to do my own sort of benchmarks. I want something that already exists. And Shadow of the Tomb Raider fit the bill. So I ran the built-in benchmark on an internal SSD, the ORICO SSD inside my system, and also on my 2 network drive options. And I was expecting to see like a lower frame rate due to loading resources from the hard drive. Yeah, no, that didn't happen at all. The frame rates were basically completely identical between all 3 systems. So I guess that's comforting to know. No matter how slow your hard drive is, the frame rates are not affected. So clearly I'm going to have to dive a little bit deeper into this with some more analytical approach other than just looking at frame rates and the shadow benchmark. Now obviously I could run a tool like Crystal Disk Mark. It won't run over a network share, even a mapped drive letter, but I can still use it on my iSCSI drive and just assume the performance over Samba will be at least a little bit worse. And as expected, my drive went from 7,000 megabyte per second read speeds, direct attached PCIe Gen 4x4, down to just like 120 over a gigabit network. That's exactly what I would expect over a gigabit network, but it's a huge drop in read performance. Of course, I'm not satisfied with just a pure block hammering synthetic benchmark, so I use a tool called 3D Mark Storage Benchmark. Now 3D Mark has essentially instrumented a number of different games to measure their file I/O patterns. What type of file I/O they do, is it large, sequential, how many I/O they're doing at once. And they have a series of test suites of like gaming style storage I/O. So in that test with a local attached drive, I got a 3D Mark score of 2531, which is I guess above average. And going to iSCSI over gigabit Ethernet, I got a score of 196. Ouch. So like Crystal Disk Mark, 3D Mark won't run the storage test on a network share, so I can't run the 3D Mark test on my G drive, Samba mapped letter. It'll only run it on what it thinks are local drives, which iSCSI counts for local in this case somehow. So without any automated tests to measure my Samba performance, I looked again to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now the automated benchmark again does not record FPS during loading segments, only when it's actually running the game. But I can record the entire thing just as a screen capture and go back and manually count how long it took in loading sections. So I did that. I ran the game from the local SSD, I ran it over iSCSI, and I ran it over Samba, and I got loading times. So this is the time it takes from when I click Run Benchmark to when the benchmark actually starts. Now again, so far I haven't had any problems with it working, it's just slow. So if you can tolerate a spinning hard drive style game experience, mounting your game library over a gigabit Ethernet is not bad. The frame rates are still the same. So now I'm wondering, why bother go through all the trouble of setting up an iSCSI target, an iSCSI initiator, dealing with those IQNs and garbage? What advantage does that have over using a Samba share? So now I'm going to try seeing if I can get any games to fail or not work correctly over Samba. So last night I played some episode 2, did some normal things, saving, reloading, save, just playing the game kind of stuff. And I saw one issue last night moving games onto the Samba drive. And coming back to it today, I took my computer out of Hibernate, and I'm finding another issue. So you may note here that all of these games have Steam Cloud errors. And what these games have in common is that they're all source engine games. Looks like Half-Life 2 figured itself out. The rest of them have not. And these are the only ones that are having this cloud error, these source engine games. So here on Portal 2, I click Sync. Let's try that. And it's going to fail. So for this error, I'm not actually sure what's causing it, but the lack of Steam Cloud saving is a little bit concerning for me. Well, I just tried disconnecting and reconnecting the network share, and that fixed it. So something is going wonky with Windows when it restores from a Hibernate session. The other problem I was having specifically involves games that have multiple games with the same shared folder, specifically what we used to might call a DLC like 20 years ago. So normal games like Portal 2, we can come here and click Properties, Installed Files, Move. So currently we're on drive G. So it shows here we're on games G. I can move it to C or F. But I come over here to Half-Life, and that is not an option. There's just no move. And it took me forever to figure out what was going on, but it's actually caused by Blue Shift. So this game, Half-Life Blue Shift, it is like an expansion pack. We might call it like a DLC mission. And it actually lives in the same installed files place as Half-Life. So if I uninstall this one, manage, uninstall, now I come up here to Half-Life and it's trying to do an update, but then I can come over here and the move option exists again. So I'm really not sure which games have this funny thing where the multiple games share the same folder, other than some of these really old Valve games. So anyway, I'm going to continue to try playing some different games and see how this goes. So none of the games that I played so far had any real problems. They're slow to load. Some of them are slow to load. I mean, you're basically getting like spinning Rust kind of speeds over gigabit network, but that's not awful. I tried to pick an assortment of games from old to new. I thought the old games might have more like bad file system bugs or things like that. Half-Life is the oldest game in the set and it didn't have any problems. Now the newest game in that set would probably be Resident Evil 4, and that one didn't have any problems either. The most demanding one, I think, is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And again, that one just takes a long time to load, and it runs fine. Now, the one game that did not run fine. So some of you that know me a bit more personally might know that I like virtual reality gaming. It's my Valve Index here, headset. And essentially, VR gaming is the only reason that I stick with Windows for my workstation here. So I tried out my favorite VR game, and I think it's also the most demanding game I own, full stop, Half-Life Alyx. I'd like to have you note I have achieved 100% achievements on this game, including the Gnome Vault of my own. So anyway, after waiting for that game to copy of gigabit networking forever, put on the headset and tried it out. And it was an absolutely terrible experience. So first off, the game crashed like right out of the gate, and I figured that it might be because it was low on VRAM. I still had DaVinci Resolve open, so I closed that. I closed anything else that could be using VRAM. Started the game up again, and it lasted maybe 2 more seconds. So coming out of a loading screen, immediately after that I'm in a room, I'm trying to load the surrounding area, and like I can walk a few feet and it'll just fall on its face. So clearly it's loading in assets as the game is playing and not just during the loading screen. And that, with gigabit bandwidth, is just not enough for it. It could also be related to the fact that this game is just absolutely huge. So this game is like 69 gigabytes. I think all of the other games were less than 50 on the list that I tried. Some of them, like Half-Life, are only like 500 megabytes. So it's possible that with the smaller games, they're just fitting entirely in RAM on my system. And once these assets have been hit, they're either loaded into VRAM and they stay there, and because we're not scarce on VRAM, they just stay there, or they get loaded by the Windows page cache. And I'm not as familiar with the inner workings of the Windows page cache as I am with Linux, but Linux will essentially be using all of your free RAM to cache file data. So in this case, I have 32 gigs of RAM. I think that's a pretty average amount for 2024, like for a computer like this. And so a lot of these games will just fit almost entirely in RAM. So it's possible that that's why they're running better, because once they do that load and they hit each of these files once, it stays in the page cache, not going back to the server. But that basically takes me into the next step, which is I got to go 10 gig. So I think I found out what the performance limitations are at 1 gig over SMB and over iSCSI. I don't think there are any issues using SMB for this purpose, at least with a single client. I'm going to test multiple clients later. But I am going to again try iSCSI and SMB over 10 gig. We'll see how that goes. I don't have enough 10 gig switch ports to do this experiment over my normal network, so I added a second network card to my workstation. It's a 10 gig network card, and I just connected it directly to the NAS, and I set up local IP addresses, just ULA IPv6 addresses, and then I can connect up everything just with a local network. This does mean that my NAS has now lost its internet connection, but that's fine for this test. So again, over the iSCSI disk, I ran Crystal Disk Mark and 3D Mark Storage Benchmark. Crystal Disk Mark, as expected, gave me essentially 10 gigabits per second or 100 megabytes per second of throughput. Just what I expected. It's fully saturating the link. Now in 3D Mark Storage Benchmark, I didn't see quite the uplift of 10x like I did from Gigabit. If you recall before, I had a 196 on Gigabit in Storage Benchmark. This time I got a 582, so that's about a 3 times improvement. Not bad, but not what I was hoping for. And I again ran Shadow of the Tomb Raider on all 3 of these connections, iSCSI, SMB, local disk, and compare those as well. So now I'm really getting into performance that's not different from a local disk. So at this point now, the computer, the graphics card, that kind of thing is a limiting factor in the game performance and loading times, and it's not so much the network bandwidth. So maybe now it's time to try Half-Life Alyx again and see what happens. So I put the headset back on and launched into Half-Life Alyx. The experience here was really quite night and day. So with the 10 gig connection still over Samba for the game files, I didn't have any problems running the game. There were no crashes, there was no stuttering. I came out of the loading screen, loaded into the location, walked around, explored a bit, looked at the scenery, played the piano, did all the usual stuff. Had a good time. So in this case, it seems like this game really was limited by loading asset speed, and if it couldn't load in textures or assets fast enough, it was crashing or stuttering. So now, for my final test, 2 computers using the same library. Now both of these computers are running Windows 10, so we don't have version differences here like we would between like Linux, Windows, Mac OS. I've roped in my brother's computer for this test. His computer is connected to my network Steam library, and it's got a game running right now. So we're going to see what happens as I add this library on my computer, and we try to launch our own game. Okay, so we're going to add the G drive. So for Portal, it shows up, and it looks like I can play it, so let's try it. Now, Portal is installed on the shared drive, and it's running on the other computer. So this, I guess, is the worst case for messing up someone's save games. It's also running on the wrong monitors, so you guys won't have a screen capture. So it looks like this particular game did not have an issue. I was about to go on to all the different strategies of using deduplication with ZFS in the back end, so I could have multiple people having their own games libraries, but having like 5 copies of each game, especially if you do like LAN parties and stuff like that. But maybe that's not needed. Now it probably depends again on the games you're playing. Not all of them have tight integration with Steam's APIs for cloud saving and things like that, like Portal 2 does. Some of them just save files and then Steam checks those files and syncs them. That would probably cause problems in network share. But at least it's not as bad as it used to be. So what do I think about remote Steam libraries? What am I going to continue doing in the future? So I don't like modifying my sort of production NAS setup for demos like this. That's why I have the box PC. That's why I have this Ugreen NAS. That's why I have additional SSDs from ORICO today instead of my usual setup. So if I want to stick with something long term, I'll decide to transition it from the sort of prototype stage where I make videos about it to a more production-oriented one. Now coming into this, in the past, I've seen people do this with iSCSI, and I guess there used to be limitations on Steam, maybe, on using physical drives, something like that. I've also seen people do this in much jankier ways. So recently I saw like a LAN party house website, which is really cool, you should check it out by the way. But I read through his scripts and he's like raw dogging like Linux DM, which is like not the kind of thing you do raw. So anyway, he's got like 10 PCs for his LAN parties, and the goal for him is to be able to play LAN games on all the computers around his house, and since they're playing LAN parties, the games are all the same. So he's got 10 copies of the games across all of his systems. So what he does is he boots up one system, he updates all the games, then he uses that system's drive as a clone for the rest of them. But they're read-only, so then there's a write modification layer in Flash, which is NVMe on the storage server. So he's got 10 machines, they're mounting iSCSI drives, and the changes they're making are getting stored on Flash. But because he raw dogged Linux Device Manager, he's using partitions, so he's got 10 partitions, each of a fixed size for his modifications, and it's kind of an odd setup compared to using something like LVM or ZFS, which will do a much better job of managing the storage. So anyway, I was fully expecting that that's what I was going to have to do to get a setup working across 2 computers here today. And finding that it just kind of works over Samba was like not what I expected at all. Now again, I don't know if this will work for all games. I don't know how many games it'll work for. At the very least, I can create multiple Samba shares and dedupe them in ZFS, so I don't have to keep wasting much of space. So as for what I'm going to actually do on my network, what I'm thinking about doing is moving the games library down to the storage server that I have, the one that has 16 terabytes of spinning drives and 1 terabyte of flash. So what I'll probably do there is take some of the flash space away from the ZFS flash pool and make it a special VDEV for the spinning Rust pool. That'll accelerate the metadata on the spinning Rust pool, which is just a good thing all around. Maybe in the future I'll upgrade that with another pair of 16 terabyte drives or something like that, I don't know. I don't need more storage just yet, but I mean, storage needs to always go up. So anyway, the big bottleneck for me is definitely going to be the 1 gig networking. So I have 1 gig in everything right now. My computer has a 2.5 gig port, which I could use, and that would be much faster, obviously. I don't have a 2.5 gig switch. I do have a 2.5 gig switch. I'm using it for another project right now. So it's just a plain unmanaged 5-port 2.5 gig switch. I have 4 10 gig capable SFP Plus ports on my big CRS328 that I love very much. But I'm currently using one of those to do 10 gig to the storage server. Obviously, if I take that, then I won't have 10 gig all the way through desktop to storage server. I'm using one for fiber to the test system, which I need to stick that way because I do high-speed testing there a lot. And I'm using one for fiber, but it's only 1 gig fiber, just because I have a fiber run in my house. And the last one I could go to the 2.5 gig switch and then to the desktop, which is what I had been doing in the past. But the SFP modules, like the SFP Plus 10 gig copper modules, they get really, really hot. And I don't like using them too much. So at best, I could probably get 2.5 gig to the desktop. I'm working on an upgrade to get 10 gig to the desktop, but I don't know how long that'll take. So stick around for future videos on 10 gig to the desktop. But I think if I had 10 gig to the desktop, I'd be pretty safe for all of the games that I play to be running over the network. And at 2.5 gigs, I'd be pretty happy with a lot more of the games that I play, most of them, I'd say. So at 1 gig, I don't think it's worth it to remote mount your Steam library. At 2.5 gig, it's probably getting a lot closer to worth it. And at 10 gig, it's certainly something that you can do, no problem. So anyway, if you like this, if you want to chat with me about anything like that, I've got a Discord server link down below for that. Thanks to ORICO for sending the drives for this video. That was a big help. What else? I have a Ko-fi if you want to tip me at all. I greatly appreciate that. Link down below for that as well. And I'll see you guys on the next adventure.